Now that we have examined the historical background of the time and ministry of Isaiah, and taken time to familiarize ourselves with some of the literary devices and a general overview of the book, we're in a better position to ask the question, what is the theological context? What are the major themes? How is God presented? How is humankind presented in this enormous and significant book? Let's begin by looking at the character of God and how he is particularly portrayed in this book. An appropriate beginning is with the acknowledgement that God is identified as the Holy One of Israel. Within the book of Isaiah, he is described that way fully 25 times. Outside of Isaiah and the remainder of scriptures, only 6 times. And of those 6, even one of them is quoting Isaiah. We want to remember that the revelation of God as holy was particularly accented in Isaiah's call in chapter 6, resulting in and connected to a cleansing of the prophet, so he would be qualified to be an exponent of God's message. Second, God is portrayed as creator. Here are a handful of passages that describe this. 42:5. He who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and all that comes out of it. Or 44:24. Who has made all things and who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself. God is established as creator. It's a significant theme within Isaiah. Third, he is the supreme and the sole ruler. This follows on with the fact of him being creator. Chapter 40, verse 12, for example. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal? Says the Holy One. And further on in the same chapter, who has created all of these, referring to the heavens? The implication of that rhetorical question, none other than God himself. He alone is supreme, the sole ruler. Old Testament survey writers observe this, that one of Isaiah's greatest theological contributions is his absolute monotheism. While victorious nations prided themselves on the power of their God, that is, during a period of victory, they would say, we won because our God is superior to your God. Isaiah's message conveyed a richer truth about the supremacy of Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. Isaiah taught that it was Yahweh who utilized a nation like Assyria to punish Israel. It's not that Assyria's gods were superior to the God of Israel. They were a tool in God's hands. So even the fact that Israel from time to time would suffer defeat was no indication that their God suffered defeat. He was the supreme and sole ruler. Eventually, in fact, Assyria itself would be punished by God for her over-the-top aggressions. Fourth, God is described as the one who reveals the future. We won't enlarge on this just now since it will come up more in depth at a later point in the lecture. Finally, the Spirit of the Lord. There are various passages that describe the Lord as Spirit. On the one hand, he is identified as the Holy Spirit, chapter 63, verse 11, and a comparable reference, the Spirit of the Lord, in chapter 61, verse 1. At other times, this seems to be a reference to an attribute of God, such as in 28:6, the Spirit of justice, an attribute of God. Now let's consider some major themes which appear across the book of Isaiah. To begin with, arrogance or abuse will be judged, and that on a worldwide basis. Some of the various nations that we find Isaiah addressing include Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Moab, Arabia, as well as northern and southern Israel. Consider these words from the opening of chapter 10. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless? What will you do on the day of reckoning, when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches? Nothing will remain but to cringe among the captives or fall among the slain. Next, idols are powerless. Hear these words from chapter 40. To whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare to him? As for an idol, a craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and fashions silver chains for it. A man too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not topple. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. And these words from chapter 44. All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit him nothing? He and his kind will be put to shame. Craftsmen are nothing but men. Let them all come together and take their stand. They will be brought down to terror and infamy. The blacksmith takes a tool and works it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. He gets hungry and loses his strength. He drinks no water and grows faint. The carpenter measures with a line and marks an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compass. He shapes it in the form of man in all his glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It is man's fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. But he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I'm warm. I see the fire." From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. No one stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, "Half of it I used for fuel, and even baked bread over its coals. I roasted meat, and I ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood?" He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself or say, "Is not this thing in my right hand a lie?" Chapter 46 has some similar words. To whom will you compare me or count me equal? And at the end of verse 7, it cannot save him from his troubles. Next, foreign alliances are an insult to God. From chapter 8, the northern kingdom has rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah and instead rejoices over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Rezin was the king of Damascus. Son of Remaliah refers to Pekah, the northern kingdom's ruler. And as a result of this foreign alliance, the northern kingdom allying with Damascus, with Syria, the Assyrians will come from Nineveh and roll over Damascus, destroying it, and will also attack the northern kingdom as well. Chapter 31 offers this warning. Woe to those who go down to Egypt, who look for help to Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge. But Pharaoh's protection will be to your shame. And in fact, there were overtures from Israel and also from some of the towns in Philistia along the coast seeking support from Egypt. Heschel lists 3 reasons why foreign alliances were so detrimental for Israel. First, reliance on a world power making a treaty of that sort meant that the destiny of the nations was determined by a human rather than by God, determined by weapons rather than by attachment to Him. So in this way, it was harmful for them to put their reliance on some human entity, a foreign nation. Second, it's significant that subservience to a nation such as Assyria involved accepting her gods and her cults. It's possible that the Assyrian altar, which King Ahaz of Jerusalem saw when he visited Damascus, it's possible that this was actually imposed on King Ahaz. He went back from Damascus, as you may recall, and instructed that the same shape should be followed. In fact, the old bronze altar for a burnt offering was displaced, set aside, and offerings were now burned on the new altar built on the Assyrian pattern that had been seen in Damascus. Third, an alliance with Assyria required involvement in the Assyrian military agenda. Suppose they have a skirmish with some other nation, which Israel has no concern of. Because they are allied with Assyria, they could be obliged to fight Assyria's battles, and that could put them on a pathway that was not reflective of God's global agenda. Another theme involves God sending someone known as His servant, with the realization that this individual will suffer. As we encounter references to the servant of the Lord in Isaiah, it's helpful to realize ahead of time that this servant may take one of 3 different forms depending on what the passage is. So, for example, in chapter 41, the servant seems to be the nation Israel itself. They are described in a plural fashion, you descendants of Israel. In the case of chapter 49, it seems to refer to a human prophet, someone formed in the womb to bring Jacob back to Him. And in the case of Isaiah 53, this seems to refer to a future Messiah, someone whom we recognize as being fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, particularly when it makes statements about solving humankind's problem of iniquity and sin. It reads in verse 4, "Surely He took up our infirmities." That difference between He and our indicates that this person is outside the nation and outside the vantage from which the prophet is speaking. So Israel is not an option for this individual, nor is the prophet. It's someone outside, both of those. Now I'd like to take up with you 3 of the puzzles which scholars have identified in their study of Isaiah. The first has to do with some material in Micah 4, which closely resembles Isaiah 2. The second has to do with the authorship of the book. Is it attributing to one author or multiple authors? This second involves the mention of Cyrus. First of all, material that appears both in Micah 4 and Isaiah 2. Notice these lines from Micah 4. and now compare them to Isaiah chapter 2. There are several possibilities that would result in this similarity. One could be that the material is original to Micah. The second, it could be original to Isaiah. It could be that both of them borrowed from some liturgical source outside of each, or that each developed it independently. There's no clear solution to this. It's just good to be aware of what the possibilities are. The second puzzle we'll want to consider has to do with the unity of the authorship of Isaiah. Some, as they read along through the book, observe that when we come to chapter 40, there seems to be a higher concentration of words of encouragement or reassurance. And that has given rise to some suggesting that there may be a different author contributing this message. In addition, some have felt that there is a stronger perspective reflecting an exile experience, not living in the homeland of Israel, as we reach particularly chapter 40 and following. While it's possible that there may have been more than one author contributing to this book, on the issue of theme variation, it's important to acknowledge that messages of hope and comfort also appear from time to time scattered through chapter 1 through 39. Consequently, the message of hope is not unique to 40 through 66. Secondly, we need to be careful lest there be an assumption that a single writer would not be capable of introducing a second theme into his writing. We need to be open, particularly to someone as sophisticated a literary artist as Isaiah was, that if he had a message of warning, of reproof, he could issue that. If he had a message involving narrating some historical event, he was capable of expressing that. Or if he had a message of reassurance, he was capable of expressing that. We want to be careful lest we limit the author to a restricted field of expression which would be far below his capability. As to the exilic perspective, on the one hand, it's possible that this material was written by someone outside of Israel. But before settling with that conclusion, it's worthwhile observing that even during the historic period attributed to Isaiah proper, he was in contact with people who were displaced. Keep in mind that the northern kingdom of Israel fell in 721. Isaiah began his ministry about 20 years earlier, so he would have been familiar with people fleeing from exile. He would have, in essence, a ringside seat to the distress which an exile would express. In addition to this fact, we want to observe that some of the practices or circumstances described in Isaiah 40 through 66 frankly do not fit well with an exilic origin. The writers of Old Testament survey make this observation: details of Jerusalem or Palestinian passages, and here they're pointing particularly to 56 through 66, are frequently not at all in harmony with the post-exilic period. And here I should clarify, this perspective is post-exilic, not just exilic. They go on to say the idolatry, the high places, and similar sins are characteristic of the period before the exile, not after. That's a valuable principle to keep in mind. Idolatry was a trap that Israel recurringly fell into until finally cured of it at great pain and cost through the exile. Consequently, if we encounter indictments against idolatry, it's a pretty good indication that that's being written from a pre-exilic, before the cure environment. Manuscript evidence. It's worth observing that there's not yet been found any ancient manuscript representing the actual Hebrew, nor any version representing translation into an ancient language. There has arisen no manuscript of these sorts which gives any indication that the book of Isaiah existed in 2 or more parts. Now, certainly a manuscript might be divided, and in fact that's the case just because of sheer length. Too much for one scroll. That's true for the large Isaiah scroll in the first Qumran cave. But what we're observing is that the division point does not coincide with the place that scholars feel there may be a change in authorship due to theme or perspective. That is an argument from silence. That is to say, it hasn't shown up, but it might show up tomorrow in the next dig. But as yet, there's no evidence for Isaiah being presented as 2 different books independent at any point. The third puzzle involves the mention of Cyrus. We find this statement in chapter 44, I am the Lord who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. Now this is striking because of the amount of lead time which this statement, in which it's given, and how much time will elapse before Cyrus actually shows up. It's something on the order of 120 years if we even date the historic Isaiah, counting down from his latest date, 681. You can see that portrayed on this timeline. The latest that we understand Isaiah may have lived, 681, 586 or 587, marks the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. And now comes the Third Empire, not the Assyrians, not the Babylonians, but Cyrus II belongs to the Persian Empire. He begins his rule in 559 BC. We might be most familiar with his Edict of Restoration given in 538, saying that Israelites that he had inherited from the Babylonians as displaced persons, he allowed them, if they wished, to return back home to Israel. That's the Cyrus that's mentioned in the book of Isaiah. And you can see there's quite a span between even the conclusion of Isaiah's ministry and the onset of Cyrus' rule. Same information in table form. Isaiah, here in the prophets column, and Cyrus not coming on the scene until some 120 years later. What I've found helpful in addressing this question is to go directly to the text and inquire what is going on, what are the themes that carry the message within which we find chapter 44, verse 24 and 6, this announcement of Cyrus, my shepherd. Here are some passages that we'll want to explore. I'll summarize them in the next slide, but I would invite you to pause this and look for yourself, see what you come up with before following on in the next slide of the video. All right, let's take a look at these. So, for example, in 41:21, God says, bring in your idols to tell us what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were so that we may consider them and know their final outcome. And then notice this, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds so that we may know that you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. But you are less than nothing, and your words are utterly worthless. He who chooses you is detestable because these idols are powerless to tell the future. Now 45:21. This is addressed to those who carry about idols of wood and pray to gods that cannot save. Declare what is to be. Present it. Let them take counsel together. Who foretold this long ago? Who declared it from the distant past? Was it not I, the Lord? And there is no God apart from me, a righteous God and Savior. There is none but me. Once again, it's the characteristic of having the authority to predict the future which sets God apart from false gods. From 48:14, God asks the question, which of the idols has foretold these things, namely the identity of the captor who will overpower Babylon? Rhetorical question. There is no one out there who is telling ahead of time who will overpower Babylon. And so we see this message, a theme running through this section of Scripture within which there is the announcement of Cyrus coming. The theme that false gods fail a particular test. 46:10. On his part, God says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. Making known the end from the beginning. This is part of God's portfolio. 44:24. I am the Lord who carries out the words of his servants and fulfills the predictions of his messengers, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. Not only is Cyrus named, but it's indicated that he will authorize the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. The context of that announcement is clearly God declaring that he fulfills predictions. And 45:4, I summon you, Cyrus, by name. There is no beating around the bush. The prophet, as he declares this oracle, knows that God is making an issue of naming a ruler ahead of time. It's not just incidental or thrown in. That is the crux. And so we find that the God of Israel passes the test being which so-called God or authentic God, which claimant to this authority, has the power to tell ahead of time what is going to transpire. It's within this litmus test environment that God announces by name a future ruler. Thus, if we were to ask the question, why does this mention of Cyrus appear in this portion of Isaiah? On the one hand, a superficial read would suggest, well, the people need some encouragement. And this is one of the components that gives rise to the surmisal that this section of Isaiah has predominantly a message of hope, of encouragement. Certainly it was encouraging to hear that someday a foreign ruler would come who would issue an edict for the repopulation, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and the building up again of the temple. However, I trust you've seen that the theme recurring time after time in this nest, this environment within which we find the announcement of Cyrus, that theme is this. People of the earth, you seem to have trouble getting used to the concept that there is only one God. Well, here, let's put it to a test. If you can tell me what's going to happen before it happens, then I'll agree that you may have a pipeline to some supernatural being who's worth dealing with. But no one has been able to do that except me. And so God is saying, I am the only God in the entire ballpark, in the entire universe. It's a showdown, a litmus test of authentic deity And the prime exhibit for that is the specific naming of this Persian ruler before the Persians are even on the radar. The next group is going to be the Babylonians to overthrow the Assyrians. The Persians aren't even a blip on the scope. So it's a very distant prediction. And as the Israelites would look at that later on, they would have to conclude, and not only the Israelites, but others, if they're willing to allow that this is the purpose of this announcement. This is a powerful affirmation that the Sinai covenant God of Israel is the only God of the universe and beyond it. So we see that the prediction concerning Cyrus, this is disclosed to demonstrate this fact that alone the God of Israel is the true God. Listen to the words of Gerhard von Rad. Again, this is coming from his theology volume, quoted in Old Testament Survey. He states that Deutero-Isaiah, referring to this section, puts in bold relief the question of who is the controller of world history. And the answer he gives almost takes one's breath away. The Lord of history is he who can allow the future to be told in advance. Perhaps you were wondering, is there any other precedent for such a specific sort of naming with such an extensive lead time? The coming of Josiah, king of southern Israel, was predicted by name more than 3 centuries before he arrived. 3 centuries. You can check it out in 1 Kings 13:1 and following. The situation went like this. Southern kingdom and northern kingdom split after Solomon, Rehoboam taking the south, and Jeroboam the north. This would be Jeroboam the first, establishing the northern kingdom of Israel with the capital at Samaria. At that time, an unnamed prophet confronted Jeroboam I, predicting the splitting of the pagan altar that he had set up at Bethel. It would just be split and destroyed. And secondly, naming a Davidic descendant, Josiah by name, who would sacrifice priests on that altar. False priests would be executed on that altar. That the prediction is in 1 Kings 13, and the fulfillment shows up in 2 Kings 23:15 and following. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and the high place he demolished, referring to Josiah. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord, proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. Now let's consider the messianic mentions that we encounter within Isaiah. There's a high concentration of them within this rich prophetic book. So, for example, in chapter 7, the virgin will be with child and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. With regard to his rule, in chapter 9, for to us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, a clear attribution of deity, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He's connected with Jesse, that means the Davidic line. In chapter 11, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. There's mention of him suffering in the form of being beaten. From chapter 50, I gave my back to those who beat me. And to him bearing sin, in particular being pierced for transgressions in chapter 53. A man of sorrows, he was pierced for our transgressions. And the anointing with the Spirit in chapter 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. A passage that you may recall Jesus used at the inauguration of his public ministry. Finally, let's turn our attention to asking, how can the message of Isaiah have impacted the people of his day? Routinely, we want to discipline ourselves at the stage of application to ask, what was God hoping would be the change in the audience that first heard this message? There are three concepts which I'll lift out for us. This is by no means exhaustive. But first we find the declaration that God is holy. And so the audience would need to reckon with that and reconcile themselves to that attribute of God. God is supreme above all. There are no competitors. And realizing that God holds the future. How then can these affect us today? First, the holiness of God. Let's keep a firm grasp on this truth while at the same time affirming his love. Interesting, isn't it, that Isaiah has both the confrontation with God's righteous expectations, but also some of the richest words of encouragement and reassurance that we find anywhere in Scripture. They're in Isaiah. If we remove the absolute holiness of God, if we lessen that, if we dilute it, then consequently we subtract from the enormity of the stigma that Christ suffered when he became sin for us. And we reduce or diminish the prodigality, the overflowing generosity of God's grace toward us. Indexing with, calibrating to the holiness of God will help us, on the one hand, realize how heinous, how terrible is sin, and on the other hand, how gargantuan, how just absolutely astronomical is the grace of God. Second, God is supreme. That is to say, there are no competitors. The sooner we ingrain this into our lives, even today, the sooner we will be anchored in God's power to hold us and to bring us through to his assured victory. And third, God's grasp of the future. God not only knows what will happen, he also knows what should happen. And furthermore, he possesses more than enough power to assure that it will happen. From this, we can derive great courage. There's a statement attributed to Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain. If I recall correctly, this actually happened during a parachute jump. And he says there is, with his typical wit, there is nothing more exhilarating than being shot at without consequence. As we walk through this life, there will be times that the enemy will be taking shots at us. He will be endeavoring to dislodge us, to dissuade us from our purpose in following God, with one effect, with one technique or another. But we know who grasps the future and who assuredly can deliver us successfully to God's intended victorious conclusion. And so with Churchill, there is nothing more exhilarating than following the God who holds the future and periodically getting shot at in one way or another, but without any enduring consequence because God is victor.